Arthur Billy Edwards, A Story of the Somme. Arthur Edwards, also known as Billy, was born on a cold January morning in 1897 in the village of Ramsbury, east of Wiltshire, where the land rolls gently and life followed the rhythm of seasons rather than clocks. There was nothing in his early life to suggest the way it would end. Like most boys of his time and place, he would have worked young, hands in soil, or tending horses, or carrying out whatever labour the day demanded. When war came in 1914, it arrived not as something real, but as something distant, spoken of in newspapers and on street corners. But for young men like Billy, it didn't stay distant for long. He joined the army early, still barely out of boyhood. His first regiment was the cavalry, the 18th Hussars. That alone suggests he had experience with horses and a certain self-discipline. However, by 1916, the war had no use for cavalry. Men were dismounted, reassigned, absorbed into the infantry. Billy became one of them, transferred into the 7th Battalion of the East Yorkshire Regiment. There would have been months of training in England, including rifle drills and route marches. Long periods of waiting mixed with rumours of deployment. The journey to war usually began quietly. Troops boarded trains crowded with kit bags and rifles, passed through southern ports under military guard, and crossed the Channel in crowded transport ships, often at night to avoid German submarines. For many soldiers, the emotions were conflicted. Some were excited, some nervous, others deeply afraid but unwilling to admit it aloud. Many still believed they would survive. Many convinced themselves the war might soon end. By the time Billy reached France in 1916, the Battle of the Somme was already consuming entire battalions. The men arriving from England would have seen endless columns of wounded heading in the opposite direction. Even before reaching the trenches, they understood the reality waiting ahead. The great advances promised in July had stalled into attritional fighting among mud, shattered villages, and obliterated trench systems. The ground around Gueudecourt and Le Transloy had been fought over repeatedly. What had once been farmland and open rolling country had become a grey wasteland of shell holes and broken timber. The trenches offered little relief. They were no longer the structured lines shown in maps or imagined in training. The constant rain and shelling had collapsed their walls. Duckboards had sunk or floated away. Water pooled along the bottom, where men stood for hours in wet boots. Their feet softened, swelled and split, a condition known as trench foot. The skin whitened, then blackened. Infections followed. For some, it meant evacuation. For others, it meant amputation. By the time autumn came, Billy had been in the army nearly 3 years. He wrote home less than 2 weeks before his death. The letter was brief, but it told the truth plainly. "It's murder out here now," he wrote. There was no poetry in it, no attempt to soften what he saw. Billy lamented he would be happy to, quote, "come home with an arm or something off." He simply wanted to survive and see his family again. He enjoyed his time in the Hussars and believed his time in the infantry was, quote, 2 years of my life wasted. He went on to report, "It's murder out here now. Mud and slush up to your knees everywhere. They can't get the wounded away. They are laying out in the mud, dying from exposure. If a fellow is wounded, he has to lay and die." Billy goes on to say, "But you are far better dead than a life like this. You are out of all your misery. The cold is terrible. Rain, sludge, shells, and dead bodies everywhere." Conditions were indeed appalling. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and broken, interrupted by cold, by discomfort, or by the ever-present sound of artillery. In the days leading up to early November, the battalion was operating near the village of Le Transloy during the final phase of the Battle of Le Transloy. By then, the offensive had lost any sense of momentum. What remained was attrition. Short advances measured in yards, paid for in lives. Orders came down for another movement forward. Billy's company was in reserve at first, positioned behind the line near the shattered remains of earlier fighting. As the day wore on, the situation at the front demanded reinforcement. The order was given. They were to move up. Billy was assigned as a guide. It was his job to lead officers and men across the broken ground toward their objective, through terrain that had been obliterated by months of shelling. It was dangerous work. Runners moved alone or in pairs, often across open ground. They were visible, they were exposed, and they were essential. On the afternoon of Sunday the 5th of November, they moved out. The distance was just over a mile. It might as well have been 10. They left the relative cover of their position and stepped into open ground. Almost immediately, they came under observation. Somewhere behind the German lines, artillery observers watched for movement. Once spotted, the response was swift. A barrage began. Not a single explosion, but a curtain, shell after shell falling in succession. There was no real cover, only shallow depressions and shell holes filled with water. Machine gun fire joined in, cutting across the field. Still, they pressed forward. Billy was ahead, doing what he had been ordered to do, leading, guiding, moving steadily through the chaos. Another guide was just in front of him. Behind them, the company followed as best they could. They were close now, within a few hundred yards of where they needed to be. And then it happened. A shell landed between the two guides. There was no warning beyond the brief, indistinct sound that every soldier came to know, the incoming note of artillery, too late to react to. The explosion was immediate and overwhelming. When the officer behind them regained consciousness, he found himself partially buried by the blast. Then he saw Billy. He had been killed instantly. The violence of the shell had ended his life in a single moment. Under normal circumstances, stretcher-bearers or burial parties would attempt to recover the dead and wounded as quickly as possible. But by November 1916, conditions around Le Transloy had become some of the worst seen during the entire Somme offensive. Like many soldiers killed during the battle, Billy was left where he had fallen. His body likely remained on the battlefield for some time, possibly days, while the fighting continued around him. Recovery parties usually worked at night when shellfire eased, moving carefully through darkness and mud to search for the dead and wounded. Over time, many soldiers simply disappeared into the battlefield itself. Billy's body was never formally recovered or identified after the battle. Today, his name is recorded among the missing on the Thiepval Memorial, alongside thousands of other men whose graves were lost in the mud and destruction of the Somme. In the days that followed, his name would have been recorded in the battalion's casualty returns. These lists were compiled under difficult conditions: names, ranks, numbers, and brief notes: killed, wounded, missing. They were passed up through the chain of command, from company to battalion, then onward through administrative channels. From there, the process became more formal. The War Office would eventually issue an official notification to his family, a telegram or a letter, brief, factual, impersonal. But that was not the only record of him. Captain John Moore, who commanded his company, wrote to Billy's father. So did another officer who had been beside him at the moment of his death. In one of the letters, the officer beside Billy described how they moved together toward the road from Gueudecourt to Le Transloy, with Billy slightly ahead. He wrote, "When we got to within a short distance of the road, a shell burst between your son and myself. I was within about a yard of him and was knocked unconscious by the explosion. Your son was killed instantly." The sentence is short and direct. He continued, he suffered no pain. Whether the officer truly knew that, or whether he hoped it might bring some comfort to Billy's parents, no one can now say. The letter closed respectfully, quietly. He was a brave and reliable soldier. Today, there is no grave that bears his name. Instead, he is remembered on the Thiepval Memorial, one of thousands who were lost in that landscape of mud and shellfire, whose bodies were never recovered or identified. His name is carved in stone. When the war finally ended, the trenches around the Transloy did not disappear overnight. The land had been torn apart by years of shellfire, dugouts, wire, and defensive lines carved deep into the earth. Entire hillsides had been reshaped by war. But slowly, over the years that followed, the battlefield was reclaimed. Shells were cleared where possible, the ground was levelled, farmers returned, and, gradually, the scars of the Somme were covered again by fields of wheat and pasture. And yet, the battlefield never fully disappeared. Across the fields of northern France and Belgium, farmers continue to uncover what has become known as the Iron Harvest, a deadly collection of unexploded artillery shells, grenades, bullets, rusted weapons, and sometimes the remains of soldiers. Farmers gather the shells into piles at the edges of their properties, waiting for bomb disposal teams to collect them. The Iron Harvest has been a constant source of artifacts for the museum located near the Thiepval Memorial. During the First World War, more than 1 billion artillery shells were fired across Europe. Millions never exploded. Instead, they sank deep into the mud of battlefields like Verdun, the Somme, and Ypres, where entire landscapes were shattered by constant bombardment. Even today, many of these shells remain dangerous. Some still contain chemical agents, such as mustard gas and phosgene. Bomb disposal units in France continue to destroy tons of wartime explosives every year. There are other reminders too. In certain light, early in the morning, late in the afternoon, or after rain, the old trench lines still reveal themselves as long, shallow depressions. Along the roads and at the edges of fields, small cemeteries appear, orderly, precise, and still. Rows of white headstones stand against the open sky. Some bear names, others do not. And not far away, rising above the landscape, stands the Thiepval Memorial. It is vast, larger than anything around it, and it carries the names of thousands of men who have no known grave. Among them is Arthur Edwards. There is no marker to show exactly where he fell, no cross in the field, no stone set into the ground. Somewhere between the roads, between the villages, on land that is now ploughed and seeded, the moment came and passed without leaving a visible trace. The shell burst, the noise faded, and the earth closed over it. And so the story does not end where he died. It continues in the ground itself, in the fields that were once a battlefield, in the names carved into stone, and in the knowledge that beneath the calm surface of the present, the past is still there, not gone, just buried.